I'll talk about the reasons we outsource, and primarily I'm going to be talking about offshore outsourcing. Secondly, to persuade you that outsourcing or offshoring for cost benefit alone is dangerous. We'll speak about that. And that simple ROI calculations really are not appropriate in this kind of offshore outsourcing, even though they're universal. Obviously, offshore outsourcing does work in many situations, and I'm going to cover 3 case studies as I talk. So the primary long-term reason to offshore has got to be driven by your strategic goals, and that is primarily doing the work that you need to do, gaining the expertise and project flexibility you'd otherwise not have in-house, and keep your focus on the core competencies you have, and not primarily cost savings. In fact, the same principles that Mike Collins talked about yesterday, which he described how Alexion, used to pick their CRO, apply here. So the primary goal of this talk is at the conclusion, hopefully you'll be more informed about the risks and benefits of offshore outsourcing and the operational considerations that may be different from domestic CRO. So I'm Steve Herbert. Thanks very much for the introduction. This is my leather-jacketed cousin, Albert. Albert's going to be accompanying me during this presentation. I have a friend who's a naturalist who told me that these fellows are due to global warming making their way slowly but surely up the East Coast, and in 200 years will be common residents of Massachusetts. So come on, Albert. I come, just like my company, Cytel, from a software and algorithm background, as many of you could tell from the introduction. Cytel and I decided to enter the clinical research services business in 2005. We did so with an initial contract from Wyeth, at that time together with Jerry Schindler, who's now with Merck. By 2008, it was obvious we needed professional help, and we expanded over time to what today is a very successful 2/3 of our business. We're still a private company, and by all accounts, a very small specialty CRO, known in part for our designing and running adaptive trials, and also in part because we have a significant Indian team. Our 2 founders and our CEO, though American, have Indian heritage. Very early on, much before the whole offshoring craze began, we began an Indian team which was initially doing our software development. So we had a lot of experience about those communication issues that we just heard about from Dennis, and many of the operational issues that Maria talked about in her talk. A number of things have long perplexed me about clinical outsourcing. One is why millions of almost identical SaaS programs are written over and over, day after day, with only the tip of a hat to standardization of either the process or look at the efficiency of the tool, SaaS itself. It's also embedded. We tend not to stand back and ask the few questions, the obvious questions. Another one is why so many billions are spent on outsourcing, and there are so few quantitative studies about cost and quality, and why so little is actually known about the benefits. I mean, the broad, longer-term ones, like the benefits, the social benefits to medicine, social costs in terms of shifting employment patterns and so forth. And then the shorter run, even the shorter run cost efficiency equations, which tend to drive the procurement decisions. We heard a lot about that yesterday, and partnerships. So I'm going to ask, how do we start making sense of all of this? So let's start at the top. Outsourcing is really big business. According to the Gartner Group, it's $288 billion worldwide this year. At the moment, India is the biggest recipient of services outsourcing, which applies here. and China, the largest beneficiary of manufacturing outsourcing. Of that 288 billion, about 50 billion is spent in our industry, about 20 on the CRO, and about another 30 in contract management. Contract manufacturing. By the way, I deal with, in Cytel, with negotiations, contract language, pricing, and problem solving, so you have a sense of my background there. So offshore outsourcing is a fact of life because it provides three seductive components, which you see in this slide: cost savings, more labor flexibility, and also access to specialized skills. So Avoca, who I got this data from, run an independent consortium. You're probably familiar with them, serving the biopharma and CRO sponsors, focused on quality in outsourcing. And here are the top 5 reasons people gave sponsors gave to Avoca for entering outsourcing relationships. Naturally enough, cost is number 1, cost savings. 3 years later, those same sponsors were complaining about quality. So here are the real reasons: low cost of labor, avoidance of regulations, taxes, energy costs, labor benefits, short run growth. Well, you get the idea, but it's backwards. It's really backwards. By the way, naturally, if you're offshoring for enrollment and monitoring, these decision criteria may be different. What I did mention is Cytel's offshore outsource business is exclusively biostats and data management. It's much easier to offshore that without some of the logistical considerations that Maria talked about this morning. It isn't always plain sailing establishing an offshore unit. In 2004, Pfizer set up a Mumbai statistical programming shop. In 2012, they closed the operation and pulled out. And Pfizer is not alone in well-funded, well-managed offshore operations that ran into trouble. So I'm going to ask the question, how is it possible to that something with so much promise can be so difficult to make work and so frequently mismanaged? So the beginning of this story starts with expectations, and that path takes us through cost savings and eventually to the real reason we outsource. So I mentioned cost savings, labor flexibility, and access to specialized skills. But buried in those benefits are the sources of failure. The first is the primary problem that the pharma business, although we heard yesterday, frequently these decisions are driven by procurement, and the procurement guys want 10, 25%, 100, they want to push the cost down. Primary problem is the pharma industry, is not the expense line. I understand that's a wee bit controversial. It's the revenue line. It's patent expiries, declining sales cut by generics, and the immense difficulty the industry overall is having in reliably replacing this income. So let me take a moment to explain the chart. What it shows, by the way, this is from the Pharma Executive publication last year. What it shows is Pfizer lost $10 billion worth of sales between 2011 and 2012. Nearly $20 billion of sales were wiped off the slate of the top 3 companies on this list alone. It's the revenue line that's the problem, not the expense line. So why does all this matter? Especially if you're not in one of these companies. If it doesn't already matter to you, there will come a time when someone asks you, probably your VC or your board member, why not do this in China or India or someplace cheaper? And you need an answer. Outsourcing is clearly a key for some companies in some situations in being able to stay in the game long enough to replace those sales. For most companies, it's part of a bundle of tactics to improve focus, R&D productivity, and profitability. What I observe is that when Cytel's clients had identified those specialized skills they need to make a successful project, we could focus on outsourcing the non-core activities, plus some highly prized but rarely used expert skills that a sponsor themselves may have difficulty providing. One example that Cytel has done is operational simulation of clinical supply chain in dose adaptive studies. very infrequent that you're going to need that, but when you need it, it becomes important. In that particular case, the primary chemical was about $1 million an ounce, and there was only a limited amount of supply. The company that acquired this, they had no intention of manufacturing anymore, so it was run into the clinical trial, and if you use too much supply, you're going to run out. So as I said, to outsource for cost-benefit alone is always dangerous, but to offshore for cost-benefit alone is doubly so, because the short-run benefits it provides may be reversed by economic or political changes quicker than it takes to realize true gains. That may sound surprising, but we'll talk about that in a second. The inefficiency and inexperience of an offshore workforce may not, in many circumstances, and I have specific personal experience of this I'll speak about, be compensated by the low cost of labor, which is stunning, because if you look at the equations today, it's about a fifth of the cost for an Indian biostatistician in India, in Pune, where we have one of our 3 teams, than it is for the same skill, apparently, in the US. The cost benefits, in fact, often are a consequence of taking the right strategic decision and not the cause. A consequence of this inexperience can be a quality gap. So here's Albert again. Unreliable work, rework, extended time to get it right, misunderstood instructions, considerable project management overhead, such as the need to give detailed instructions when fewer or none are needed for the in-house team. So this may seem silly, but I've run into precisely this time and time again with a team that for Cytel is in fact in-house. They're employees of Cytel. We did have direct control over hiring them, training them, putting them on jobs. But even the best laid plans will go wrong when you relinquish control, no matter how foolproof you make the instructions, no matter how simple, how well documented, something's bound to turn up that you didn't plan for. In my first experience with providing Indian outsourced services, it was then to Wyeth. It took us an entire 3-year contract. Now, what you have to understand then, this was Cytel's first contract. It was biostats. We had a ton of experience doing that. We thought we'd do a really terrific job. We were stumbling, and it took us that 3 years to iron out all of the issues, from cultural to telecommunications, from work definition to managerial challenges. The contract was not renewed, and evidently we were not alone, because 22% of those companies surveyed by Avica reported as having discontinued their outsourcing relationships because of poor quality of deliverables. So something that's not talked about, well, it's talked about a lot, but not something that's published about really widely. But so maybe Albert won't show up at your next trial. He's got 200 years to make it up here. But you could still be up to your neck in an alligator swamp. Of course, Cytel got better, much better at the offshoring gig. Not every company is better, and surprisingly, it's some of the biggest that are having the most problems. So in my next experience, we used a mixed model, and by the way, that contract has now been renewed 3 times, each for a 3-year renewal. So that's been going on for almost 7 years now, so we're into the 3rd renewal. And that's using a mixed model, which is US resources. So we have a small team in Philadelphia and resources in Pune. The incredibly surprising thing, when we came to renegotiate the deal, we were subject to a reverse auction. It's one of those procurement things that does exactly what I'm telling you you shouldn't get involved in, which is to focus on cost alone. So the procurement contracting guys, they were totally focused on cost. The decision in the end, they had a matrix and it was all kinds of things, and cost was one of the columns. And I just have a feeling that the way the decision was made in the end was gut feel and relationships and experience. In any event, we did give up something on the cost, so we came down. And this contract's interesting to me because when we did that, we had to do very, very careful budget projections. And in doing that, I discovered that there were certain types of work that were taking 10 times as long to do in our team in India than there were in the US, and I asked our US people and the Indian folks, what's going on here? Why are we bothering doing it in India? It's twice as expensive. And what I discovered is the degree of efficiency, which was large and surprising, to me, wasn't surprising to the participants. And it was in certain situations where the tasks were complex, not well standardized, where communication was at a premium, where you needed to go back and forth a lot, where the time difference, which is 9.5 hours, by the way, from the East Coast to Pune, became an issue. India became cost efficient for us, where safety reports, in safety reports, for instance, where the quality was standardized, the programming was more routine and relatively simple. So the favor that was done to us when our sponsor came and asked us to do the cost justification was that we had to go back and look at the precise allocation of cost, how it was incurred. We redid all the numbers and found out how we could better use our team so that it was more efficient. So this experience has led me to ask why it's so difficult to get the offshore outsourced experience to be successful, and what we do differently to make it work 100% of the time. So are there reasons to worry that the short-run benefits of outsourcing may be outrun by the larger political or economic forces? So I'm changing tack just a little for my next example. Yep, there are several reasons to take this danger seriously. One is history, the instability of global economics. Two, the outsourcing implementation and startup experience that I outlined, and some more I'm going to outline in the case study I'll end with. And three, the fact that quality and thus productivity are constant companions of outsourcing. They're constant companions for a number of very real, tangible reasons. So let's start looking at the history and then glancing forward at the global trends, and hopefully you'll be a little more informed when you come to do this kind of outsourcing. So Grateful Dead's talented lyricist Robert Hunter wrote some apt lines from his song about outsourcing. He says, "History turns upon the tides and not the deeds of men." Well, let's firstly say what I mean by offshore outsourcing. I mean labor arbitrage. It's the transfer of labor to cheaper regions, which is enabled by IT and communications. Let's also say that it's the transfer of skills from within your organization to another organization, the provider. So we are today as outsourcers creating and at the same time participating in one of the great modern flows of skill and currency, from the industrialized north to the developing south, India, China, Taiwan, as well as Eastern Europe. The Industrial Revolution was an immense wave in history that presaged the greatest flow of capital and goods and labor the world's ever seen, mostly from the old world to the new, or from England to the US. By comparison, today's outsourcing trends are vastly more regulated: borders, walls, data privacy laws, visas, government regulatory agencies. So why does this all matter to companies and to CROs in this audience today? Because simply put, decisions your company makes tomorrow about whom to partner with and where in the world to outsource, for how long and at what cost, all of this risk is being turned upside down right now as I'm talking. And when you're not just transferring budget but also skills, you need to be doubly alert to the decision and the consequences, while with a little forethought, most of the negatives can be ameliorated, as my next case will show. First of all, let's run through these bullets. Increased constraints in labor flow. So most CROs are subject to this. And actually, with the close down of government, the Department of Labor now is shut. That means no more H-1B visas are being issued because you require labor certification to do that. That's done by the Department of Labor. Reduced constraints on the movement of capital and goods versus even maybe 10, 20 years ago. There's much reduced banking regulations, increased global flow of electronic funds, increased ease and decreased costs of transportation. All of this has been made possible, obviously, by the radically decreased communication costs and increased technology, which act to reduce the geographic concentration of industrial development. So think about this on a broader scale. Everything up to now is Western Europe and US. That is changing, and it's changing really fast. And there are no barriers to it. And they act to lower the cost to spread ideas and practice, which results in improved coordination and efficiency within corporations across different countries. And the increased technology enables more tasks to be offshored. And here's a great quote from Stephen Roche, an outspoken analyst and chief economist with Morgan Stanley. It says, the internet has changed forever. By the way, this comes from a few years back. The climate, the competitive climate for most white-collar knowledge workers, that's everyone in this room, courtesy of near ubiquitous connectivity, the output of the knowledge worker can now be emailed to a desktop anywhere in the world. This brings low-cost, well-trained, highly educated workers in Bangalore, Shanghai, Eastern Europe, Central Europe into the global knowledge worker pool. Cytel has generally worked, so it's not just email, of course. We generally work on other people's, inside other companies, our sponsor companies' firewalls. So we are literally highly integrated within that company. And the majority of our staff, there's about 300 people in India and about 30 people in, actually, more like 60 now in Western Europe and US. So it's happening really fast. Everyone in the developing South's worried about this graph, so I'll explain it. This is called the Lewis turning point, so anyone who's done their Economics 101 knows this is when the surplus labor evaporates, pushing up wages, consumption, and inflation. In fact, last year when I got up here, I said it's going to happen and it's going to happen soon. It's actually, interestingly enough, happening more slowly than we'd expect, but it's happening surely. The inflation rates, just the wage inflation rates in India, in IT and healthcare for the last few years have topped 12, the low teens. And 1 year they actually topped 20%. It's changing. And that's what will turn upside down your decisions on offshore outsourcing if they are cost alone. So that's it. And anyone who doesn't know what the Lewis turning point is worried about this, which is US immigration reform. This is a quote from the chief executive of Cognizant. So a lot of the offshoring companies are extremely concerned about the reform proposals because it affects their margins. It affects what you're doing. If it affects their margin, it's going to affect their cost. It's going to affect your contracts. Visa costs, the availability of those costs are going to change. And what's actually happening is kind of interesting. Cytel is already in the middle of this because we started as a US company. Cognizant started as an Indian company. What's happening is there's more need to place skilled people back in the US. Cytel does this all the time with a constant rotation of 3 to 6 month periods where we bring people over into the US to get direct experience working here, to understand the culture, understand the economy, and working with our sponsor team. So Cognizant is doing it by acquisition of smaller companies to get a larger presence in the US. So it's a demonstrable fact that simplistic ROI calculations do not reflect the realities of startup costs. Crossing the experience chasm, so you all remember Crossing the Chasm book. Crossing the experience chasm is really interesting. Our largest vendor that we do offshore outsourcing with is a big West Coast company, and they required us in part of the quality metrics, which we'll look at in a minute, to have people with a certain number of years experience. We did that, but we weren't getting the same productivity from them. So it doesn't matter what qualifications your folks have got. It doesn't even matter what experience they appear to have on paper. The reality is that 5 years experience working in India is not equivalent to 5 years experience working for a big pharma company in Western Europe. Simply the work is different, the culture is different, and the experience load you're likely to get at a team, say with Glaxo, Merck, or Amgen, is really significantly different than what you're likely to get working in India. It's a big experience chasm, and that's when I mentioned that 10-to-1 ratio that we were getting on some of that complex work. Some of it's cultural, some of it's communication. Most of it was simply the experience. The team we have in Philly is much more experienced at doing that. So outsourcing obviously can and does work in many situations. So we're on to a current contract I have in Cytel. And this case study, courtesy of EMD Serono, represents getting most of the controls set right up front, adjusting those that need it as we went along, and getting the best people on the team to do it well. So the project is delivered and managed exclusively from Cytel's India office in Pune. So this is actually the only one of the three contracts I've mentioned that's exclusively offshore outsourced. The others all have a US onshore presence. Serono wanted the cost savings. They didn't want to compromise quality and flexibility, and they met the guy who was going to manage it in Pune, thought extremely well of him, and it's worked very, very well. So a lot of its relationship, some of its culture. Our success here depended in part on setting realistic expectations gained from experience and recognizing and managing the startup costs. Once they've been done, once you've got through that startup period, which can be several years, cost savings really begin to kick in. That's the reason I mentioned that you really have to, when procurement's saying, get me an extra 10%, get me an extra 50%, you really have to push back and say, no, I'm going to look at my strategic goals. If you know you're going to be in this for 10 years and you're doing functional outsourcing rather than maybe just a quick clinical trial where you're in and out in 1 or 2 years, you know you can benefit. If you're just doing it per trial and you know that trial is going to be open and closed in that period of time, you're probably not going to gain the benefit from the offshore outsourcing. To do this, Ajay Sate, who was the guy who ended up managing the contract, he also runs our India operation, actually started a new company. It's a training company called ClipLab, which is profitable in and of its own right. And it takes well-educated, ambitious Indian statisticians and programmers and provides the vocational training needed to enter the workforce as productive statistical programmers. So Cytel maintains and develops a pool of people needed to feed the outsourcing business by providing excellent work environments, specialized vocational training school, and all of that stuff, ClipLab. All of which contribute to a much lower than average turnover, which, by the way, it ends up with your starting cost being a little bit higher, but the repeat cost being lower because you haven't got the turnover. Every time someone leaves, someone new joins, you're effectively, as a sponsor or as a purchaser of those services, going to be paying more for them. So in this case, with acknowledgements to Serono for permitting me to share this information, I'll explain quickly how it works, and then I'll finish. So see what I got next. Yeah, so in order to avoid some of the obvious startup disruptions, you're still going to have some of the training, still some of the communications. We specified completely, as a number of the other speakers have talked about, performance criteria from the start and the complete governance apparatus. Now, I was involved in, as I mentioned, the whole contract negotiations and putting these into place, and they were the most detailed for this particular job, the most detailed and thorough I've ever witnessed. So they were pretty detailed and thorough documentation. So Cytel now operates as an extension arm of Serono using their internal protocols, IT infrastructure, and SOPs. Because of the lower costs, Cytel can afford, under the contract, to maintain a bench of people to provide them with a more flexible and scalable result. As my colleague Ajay has said, the project is a great example of setting expectations realistically and managing and delivering carefully. With the result, the cost savings are a natural consequence of the decision rather than the upfront driving factor, and they don't compromise the quality and flexibility. So for all that, outsourcing is clearly going to continue shaping our world in a major way, and hopefully you now have a little bit more sense of the complexity and some of the global forces that are shaping the world. So with that.